In continuing our build up to war, the actual fighting as part of the American Revolution, we pick up with the understanding that England is upset, understandably upset about the Boston Tea Party, so they passed a series of laws that the colonials call the Intolerable Acts, mainly to pay for the tea, but to punish the colonies, break their spirit. This is too much. Now, with this First Continental Congress, there was a meeting that was called in Philadelphia. Without question, Philadelphia is really the unofficial capital of the British North American colonies. By 1776, it's the biggest city with about 30,000 people. 30,000 was the biggest city, and it was the wealthiest. What helped it out even more was Philadelphia had a harbor that was open year round, contributing to its wealth. Now, at the time, it was the busiest port, even though it was nearly 100 miles from the Atlantic itself. It's 100 miles from the open ocean. It has a strong history of religious tolerance due to its Quaker origins, and there was also land available to the west. So it was kind of like a point of entry for thousands of immigrants. Thousands of immigrants. So kind of like the role New York City will eventually play. It was a neat city and it was well planned. And it had a thriving reputation of education and philosophy because one of its most famous residents was Ben Franklin. So that's where kind of the cutting edge portion comes from. In addition to Ben Franklin, the printer, there were a total of 23 printing presses. So all of the influential political pamphlets of the era start here. Now, this is the springboard for the publication of all of these things, like Common Sense, Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer that'll come, Summary View of the Rights of British America. All of these things will have their publication origins in Philly. When this Continental Congress met, it was a 2-month period. Deliberations lasted for 2 months here at Carpenter's Hall. Now, 54 delegates from 12 colonies. Obviously, there's 13. Georgia was the only colony that sent nobody. Among those present were the Adamses. So you have John Adams, you have Samuel Adams, you have Patrick Henry of Virginia, and you have the esteemed George Washington of Virginia. Over half of them were lawyers, much like John Adams, while others, like Roger Sherman of Connecticut, maybe had more humble origins, like a shoemaker. The main agenda, we can see here, the main agenda as they met was how to respond to the intolerable acts. There was a plan of union, meaning specifically bringing the colonies together. There was a plan of union that was proposed called the Galloway Plan, and it would have included a president general appointed by the king who was advised by a council elected by the people. So understand that at this First Continental Congress, the goal isn't to break away. The fact that there's a proposal of a president general appointed by the king tells us that many of these individuals thought of themselves as British and wanted to remain British. And this plan of union had initially been proposed during the French and Indian War. So again, they want to remain British. They mainly wanted a guarantee of their rights as Englishmen. So this resolution they agreed on, declaring rights to life, liberty, and property, it stems directly from that idea that we are Englishmen, so we should have the same rights as Englishmen. So after 2 months of deliberation, this First Continental Congress agrees on this resolution, and that's kind of that. The actions of the British will continue to intensify, specifically Massachusetts. Massachusetts has borne the brunt of the British actions in Boston, and they're ready to fight. So because of all of this, the Massachusetts delegation were the most radical faction in attendance at that Continental Congress. So John Adams, Sam Adams, they're what we would call radicalized. And they're, to a degree, ready to fight. Now, they claim they're simply defending their rights as Englishmen, and the Redcoats were viewed as traitors. The British knew that there was a colonial arsenal at Concord. Arsenal, meaning that the colonials have a stockpile of weapons and ammunition. To get there, Lexington is en route. Now understand that the Minutemen were what we would call the militia, citizen soldiers. By this time, nearly all towns in at least Massachusetts had a militia. And if you're a man between these ages, year old, a 16 to 60-year-old man, you are expected to serve. You're also expected to provide your guns, ammo, a bayonet, and gunpowder. These were things that were available to nearly all colonial residents. Now, this idea of providing for the common defense, everyone comes together for common defense. Eventually, that'll make its way into the Constitution. But at this point, the colonials see it as their personal role. They have to take the lead in this. Now, obviously, in addition to seizing the weapons, the British have a goal of seizing John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Hancock and Adams were hiding out in Lexington, and they were commonly viewed as leaders of the rebellion. So they take the weapons. The colonials can't fight. If they take the leaders, so if the British can capture the leaders, they think they can end this whole thing. Now, to warn the residents of the British intent, because to get from Boston to Concord, they marched through Lexington. Revere and Dawes, two men who have gone down in history for their actions here, although Paul Revere more so. They took two separate routes to warn Hancock and Adams, as well as the citizens of Lexington and Concord. What they did was they hung lanterns from the Old North Church to warn of the British route. That's where one, if by land, if they're coming by land, two, if by sea, comes from. There is a poem written about Paul Revere and his midnight ride, which is why he's more prominently remembered than William Dawes and Dr. Sam Prescott, but nevertheless, he did have a role of importance. When the British made it to Lexington, a full British regiment was met on the Lexington Village Green by a small group of militia. There were shots fired. Who knows by who first? It's kind of like the Boston Massacre in that sense. But shots were fired, killing 8 Minutemen and wounding 10 more. The British lost one horse. That's it, just one horse. They went to Concord, and they found nothing. The weapons were gone. There was advance notice of the British arrival. Those riders had done their job. So the British turned back towards Boston, and they were harassed every step of the way. They were continuously fired upon by Minutemen who shielded themselves from return fire using trees, buildings, and fences. By the time those British troops made it back to Boston, 273 Brits had been killed or wounded compared to 95 colonials. So 273 to 95. That's why Lexington is often viewed of as a British victory. Concord is seen as more of a colonial victory. John Adams famously claimed that the Battle of Lexington on the 19th of April changed the instrument of warfare from the pen to the sword. We've had armed combat. It's not like the Boston Massacre. This is fighting. The time for politics is more or less transitioning into the time for war. And since this sets the revolution off, Lexington has often been referred to as the shot heard round the world. Now, after Lexington and Concord, the wartime measures will escalate. The colonials, led by a man named Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, who starts out as a colonial, will capture a fort in upstate New York. And the British are going to provide leaders. They're going to land 3 major generals in Boston. To their end, Allen and Arnold did seize British cannon, so they got weapons. Members of the Massachusetts militia were camped on the hills surrounding Boston, and they do get reinforced by regiments from other colonies like Virginia and Pennsylvania and Maryland. So it stood to reason that if you have all these forces, you need someone in charge. The story goes that John Adams nominated George Washington of Virginia. He nominates him for general of the new army. Now we see all of these different factors. He was a sitting delegate, so he was already there. He was from Virginia. It was the most populous state, and it would get the South on board. If one of their own was the leader of the troops, they might support this rebellion. And he had combat experience from the French and Indian War. Now, this kind of upset John Hancock a little bit because apparently he had wanted the job, but he didn't have military experience. So there you have it. Washington claimed he didn't want the position, but realistically, he was the only one there in military uniform, so he had to know that something was going to happen. The interesting thing about the American Army in the Revolution is that it was fully integrated. Black and white soldiers serving together. This was the only time that the American military was fully integrated until Vietnam, the 1960s. So that's just an interesting aspect about this war. Now, as a courtesy, Washington deferred to Congress. This general took his orders from Congress, full of civilians, non-military men. This establishes the idea that civilians control the military. You know, in Washington, it was also an easier sell because he was born in North America. There were other men who had combat experience, but they weren't born in North America. He was here, he had the temper. So, Washington is the man. That leads him to take charge. Now, the British are going to try and use force to terrorize the Americans who, frankly, don't have much experience. The battle was viewed by the wife of John Adams, Abigail Adams, and their oldest son, John Quincy, from a hill near their house in Massachusetts. John Quincy Adams, he's going to become a president and a representative. He witnesses this. The Americans lose 450 men. But they picked off the British with deadly accuracy. They picked off the British as well as officers at a time when it was seen as dishonorable. Joseph Warren, Dr. Warren, died at Bunker Hill. This was a huge loss to the Americans. He had busted back down to the rank of private, so he was allowed to fight. Had he lived, it was said that he maybe could have challenged Washington for leadership of the army. But as it stood, that was not to be. At this point, there's no turning back. There are still going to be moderates, meaning there will be people who don't want war. But the Americans just took out 1,000 British troops. This was seen as proof that the British were beatable. And it was also seen as proof by some that the militia could beat British professionals, which is going to turn out to be false. Now, after losing 1,000 men, King George III and the Prime Minister, Lord North, still a bit reluctant, but they both agree that this is the time that they need to crush the rebellion. Their resolve deepens. So for both sides, There is no turning back.